Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Julie. My name is Dr. Kenneth Thigpen-Harris, also known as Dr. K. I'm the Vice President of Clinical Crisis and Specialty Services at Workplace Options. I'm based in Raleigh, North Carolina, where our headquarters are located. I have been with Workplace Options for about 9 years, but I have been in the field for well over 15 years. So I'm excited to join each and every one of you today, and hopefully we have a great time.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mary Ellen Gornick. I'm coming to you from Chicago, Illinois today. I've been with Workplace Options for 19 years this year, and I'm currently working on special projects, consulting projects, and have been working both connected with our service delivery team, Dr. Kenneth, as well as some of our client services team as well. So we're happy to be with you today.
We're happy to have you here. So perhaps we can start by asking the fundamental question: what is psychosocial risk?
Sure, I'll take a stab at this first, and then Meg, I'll turn it over to you. You know, psychosocial risk is perfect. Psychosocial risk is really the things that affect the employee's psychological response at work. And when I say the things that affect them at work, we could be talking about, you know, relationships with their coworkers. We could be talking about the relationships with their managers or their leaders. We can be talking about, you know, what is their workload? Like, is there an unrealistic workload? Are there unrealistic expectations? What are the things that are causing that additional stress? So that's what I mean by that. And when we talk about that, it can lead to affecting their overall psychological well-being. And what that looks like is there's typically a change in their behavior, their mental, their physical, their social, their emotional. So that employee that maybe is typically the one raising their hands in meetings and they typically speak up, but now that you notice they're starting to withdraw and they're not being really engaging, that could be a sign. Maybe it's the employee that is consistently now absent. Maybe it's like every Monday and Friday they're calling out the office, or maybe their productivity has decreased. That's what we mean when we talk about psychosocial risk and how it's affecting employees psychologically. And as we know, when this does happen, it leads to stress, it leads to burnout. And when this stress goes unaddressed, it could lead to the anxiety and depression, which are, of course, the top two mental illnesses that we see going on in the world globally. Meg, what would you add to that?
I think you got it, Kenneth. You covered it.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, so let's move on to how organizations can create environments free of psychosocial risks.
I can take this one. You know, given what Kenneth just said about what is psychosocial risk, I think, you know, what we know is that you can never actually have an environment free of psychosocial risks. Why is that? Well, you have certain business objectives that need to be addressed on a daily basis. So as an organization, we have a business to do and we have things related to that business, and some of those involve time constraints, some of those involve high volume of work, some of those involve scheduling that you know, may be inconvenient for a long period or a short period of time. And then on the personal side, you know, none of us ever live in a bubble. So there's always something going on in your personal life, whether it's responsibilities related to parenting or your parents, whether it's concerns about finances or some legal issue, whether it's health concerns in the family. So we don't live, you know, we don't live in a cocoon and we don't work in a cocoon. So given what, you know, Kenneth described in terms of the types of psychosocial risks that exist, they're always going to be that tension and influence between the work and your personal well-being. So what we say is that while you can't live in a work-free of psychosocial risk environment, what is most important is that you are aware of and identify what those psychosocial risks are, and look at mitigation strategies that can be put into place, and continue to evaluate them. And we'll talk a little bit more when we get in depth in this session. But it's really about identifying what are the psychosocial risks that occur. And that is not just overall organizationally, but if you have different locations, different types of work that are being done, it's not sort of a one size fits all. It really is important to sort of get down to the workplace, identify them, and then look at what are some strategies that will mitigate those risks. Kanat, anything you could add?
No, Meg, I think you did a really great job. And I love how you said, like, can an environment be completely free? And like you said, it can't, but we definitely can take those steps to mitigate those risks. And it's often interesting, especially as we start comparing this and to the health and safety of an environment. Because when we think about, do we assess for risk when it comes to physical environment? And I'm sure everyone can raise their hand and say, yes, we have a whole health and safety committee, and we have someone that walks around to complete and conduct a physical assessment of the building of, are there wires hanging out? Are there tiles coming up? Those physical things. But as we realize that health is inclusive of mental health, are we still doing that same risk assessment when it comes to the psychological safety of individuals in our workforce? And I think sometimes it becomes more challenging because people are like, I can't see that. Like, I can see the wire hanging from the ceiling. I can see the hole in the carpet. Those things are visible to my eye. But when it comes to that psychological, I can't necessarily always see that. Now, of course, the signs are often there if we're vigilant to our employees and the change in their behaviors. But when it comes to assessing for that risk in the workplace, one, I think there's the organizational side that Mary Ellen was talking about, and there's also that individual employee side. And when we talk about assessing for risk, you might be saying, well, what the heck am I looking for? Well, here's the thing. We're wanting to look for those things that cause additional stigma versus awareness. We want to understand what are those additional things that cause stress and people to be overwhelmed in the workplace. What are those things that tend to hinder those relationships in the workforce? And of course, do we have an environment that our employees trust us? Of course, the word psychological safety has been thrown out there definitely within these last 2 years, but ultimately it boils down to, can I trust the environment that I'm in? Can I trust the individuals that I work with so I can have these unashamed, crucial conversations? So absolutely, Meg, I think it definitely starts with assessing for that risk.
Thank you. I think we might be having a few technical issues. Hopefully everybody can see us now. So I'll move on with the next question. So given the events of the past 2 years, how can organizations approach well-being now?
You want to go with this one, Kanat?
Yep. Sure. So I think, over the last 2 years and, how can, companies move towards approaching it? I think the first thing is really moving from a reactive approach to a proactive approach. Let's be honest. Again, mental health and psychological safety and psychosocial risk has been around for a while. It's just now getting the attention that it really deserves. And we're so used to having that reactive response of, oh, there's been a natural disaster. My employees are stressed out. Let me do something. There's, a crisis going on. There's an employee death going on. There's something that has happened that now causes us to make a reactive response, versus now it's really about how do we become more proactive. I think another thing is when we talk about this psychosocial risk, we are really talking about something that is a multi-layered challenge that requires a multi-dimensional approach or solutions. So gone are the days of, it's World Mental Health Day, it's Suicide Prevention Month, let's do this one training if we were doing that. And now it's like, okay, now this really needs to be infused into our organizational culture where not only do we focus on the behaviors within an organization, so the behavior culture, which we're used to talking about and seeing when it comes to like the policies, the procedures, and the practices, but also it's now time to talk about the emotional culture of an organization, which we tend to shy away from. But remember, emotions are information, and we can't shy away from that. And in order to do that, we also have to learn to train and equip our managers and leaders who are very crucial and vital to being on those front lines to support their employees, because they're the ones who are interacting and engaging with them. So when there is a change, because of that psychological challenges are going on, they're hopefully going to be some of the first ones to notice it. And if we equip them with the skills to be able to have those conversations, it can definitely improve, of course, to getting us in the right place. And what we've seen are, and Mary Ellen, I know that you have done a lot of work with ambassadors within organizations and how we have seen that grow. And I'm sure you have much, much more to add to it. But maybe you could also touch on ambassadors and how companies are actually putting these into their programs to make a difference.
Sure, happy to do that. I think before I touch on the ambassadors, I just want to add to something that Kenneth said about the change in the workforce. So, 2 years ago, or almost 3 years ago, March 2020, what we saw happening was a major pivot in the way work happened. And so for some organizations, that meant your workers who came to work had to adapt to new procedures, new policies. You had to sort of re-engineer the workplace. Others pivoted to working at home. And so there was a initial sort of anxiety about adjusting to the new environments. And then over time, we adjusted to that. But over the last 2 years, what we've seen are highs and lows. We're going to reopen the workplace. No, we're not. Workers who are there were concerned about being exposed to the virus. Oh, now we think things can slow down a bit and we're a little bit safe. Whoops, now we've got Delta, then we've got Omicron. So what we've seen over the past 2 years is that, the workforce, as well as, the leadership in the workforce, has just been on a roller coaster. And so as we look to how we look at the workplace today, it's pretty different, because what's happened? Well, we've had this global great resignation. We've had individuals who had to be made redundant because of the workforce and what was happening to business, who are not coming back. So as we reassemble the workforce, hopefully at work, we're seeing something very different. So if you've had let's say a call center, for instance, where you had, 100 individuals in the call center working, now, because we're introducing flexible schedules, you might only have 50, and they're working different days. So, how do you create that safe culture? How do you give them the sense of security in terms of what's going on, what's going forward with the business? And then in terms of the organization, for individuals who are trying to attract and retain talent, you've got that other piece. How do I make my organization attractive to individuals who have sort of redefined how they want to work? So those are, the question really, which is, given the events of the past 2 years, how can an organization approach well-being? Very carefully and very systematically. So it's important to sort of look at, who your workers are, what do the workers need, and how can you provide those varied types of supports? Because you've got individuals who are new and entering the workforce. You've got individuals at mid-career levels who may be raising families, and and in that sort of stress part of life. And then you've got those individuals who are sort of moving to that late career, all having slightly different needs. So how do you create, a climate of well-being that is comfortable for everyone? And, one of the key pieces about identifying psychosocial risk is someone feeling secure and confident in their work. So that business stability, the sustainability of the business, and communicating that to individuals who work there is really important, because no one wants to go through what we went through before with all the redundancies. And Knett asked me to speak about the ambassador program. I think one of the things that we have seen that's been very effective in moving to this sort of new normal is a real attention on the emotional well-being of individuals, a real attention to look at sort of the utilization rates of employee assistance programs, how people see help. Knett mentioned the stigma, like removing that stigma to get help. And there's a lot of ways we'll talk about that. But one of the ways that we see that companies have had some real success is by introducing the concept of ambassador programs. And what that is basically volunteers within your organization that really care about mental health, and train them in the very important components of what is good mental health, and what are the signs and symptoms to know when someone is in distress. So they act as peers. So if I'm having a bad day and I'm thinking I might want to call that EAP program, but I'm not sure what I'm going to see, what kind of commitment I'm going to have to make, I can go to my peer. So I can see how to call. I can see the access in a poster on the wall, or I can get it in an email. But if I really want to know how it works, what am I going to do? I'm going to go to speak to a peer. And that peer, it can really help me and have a conversation with me about what I'm feeling, not to do any diagnosing, but really to signpost me to the best resources. So in that, we're seeing that ambassador is not only sort of the bridge, but they're also connected with the EAP on the back end so that they've got a place to go. And on the other flip side of that is if they see an employee who's really struggling, kind of in some of the ways that Knett described, they can reach out and say, are you okay? And are you really okay? Is there anything you need? Let's go have a cup of tea and have a chat about it. So, so this has been one of the ways that organizations have really sort of introduced that peer connection with the emotional support.
That's really interesting, thank you. So that moves us on to how can companies sustain their employee assistance programs?
You want to go, Knett?
Yeah, I will say it's something really simple, and it's 3 words for me. It's promote, educate, and communicate. And, I think it really comes with promoting, because I'm often surprised at how often individuals don't realize if they do have an employee assistance program or an employee support program. They're like, wait a minute, what is that? Or maybe they realize, you know what? Oh yeah, I remember on onboarding day that someone told me kind of something sort of that I had this program. But then as life happens and we do work day to day and those stressors come about, they often forget about it. So I think one, it's about promoting it. I also think it's about education, like what is the employee assistance program, how they can best support you and help to mitigate in some of these risks, because you will be so surprised at, what an employee assistance program can do. I was talking to someone just the other day about employee assistance program, and I said, oh yeah, EAPs are those things that when employees are having bad behavior, that their manager tells them to call this number. And I was like, whoa, wait a minute. I was like, it's so much more than that. And I was like, do you have time for me to kind of educate you and share some things with you? And so as we began to talk, I was able to share, like, yes, we can provide that emotional support that when we're going through so many stressors and maybe we don't have the best ability to cope in the moment, that we have that emotional support. But not only that, that practical support where, with all the changes that even Mary Ellen was mentioning, as we move from, in office to home or home to back to office, and all the decisions that we had to make with childcare or elder care for our aging parents, EAP can support with all of that. An individual who's going through a divorce, there's legal services, there's financial services, there's childcare, there's elder care. I can go on forever and for days. But it's really about all of the things that help to make an employee more productive. Because as we know, when individuals are stressed, if they're trying to find a solution to their challenge, they're going to be taking time during work and they're on their computer and their phone and they're Googling and they're asking questions and they're calling, or they're not doing anything. But an employee assistance program helps with all of that great stuff. And so I really think it's about educating about all of the great things that they do. But not only that, the EAPs are helpful for individuals, they're helpful for families, but also for organizations. So there's a piece of, that education that helps at all levels. And then I think the last part is just communication. Like, how are we sharing this information? Is it housed in one central location where if an employee realizes, like, hey, I might need some type of additional support, there is an employee resource cafe or central or hub that I can go to and just quickly find that information? Is it part of maybe an evergreen model that in one-on-ones or meetings we're kind of saying, and don't forget that, where you begin to normalize that there's this EAP or employee assistance or support program that's out there to help and support you. The more we talk about it, the more we normalize it, the more it becomes second nature, where if an individual does indeed need support, they know exactly where to go. So again, I think it's really about promotion, education, communication. And then I think in addition, it's about, really taking a step back at whoever our benefits or HR individuals are, is to kind of take a look at that utilization. And then utilizing that data, the data to make decisions to drive your well-being strategy. So oftentimes you know how we are. We collect all this great data and then it sits there getting dust, versus taking that data to say, hey, how do we put this into our well-being program, our strategies, our initiatives? What modifications and what changes do we need to make? So that's what I would say about that. Mary Ellen, what about you?
I think you're right. I love it, Connect. Promote, educate, communicate. Those are like 3 good buzzwords. I agree with you that, sometimes we focus on the utilization numbers, and we want to know how many people are utilizing the program. And, maybe it's 5% of the workforce or 10% of the workforce. But I think when we look at those utilization numbers, there's a couple of things to look at. And that is, how is this program impacting my workforce? So typically in a utilization figure, what you're going to find is how many people connected with the EAP for some counseling, or how many individuals in your workforce connected with the EAP for their work life, what we call work life. So for practical support, maybe around childcare, maybe around legal issues, maybe around financial issues, maybe around, how do I connect, what's the closest gym so I can start doing exercise. Those are kind of what we call like the practical. So the focus is really on the counseling and the practical. But when we look at those utilization figures, there's so many more people who are impacted. The number of people who come to educational seminars, the number of people who get information off of the website. And then at a deeper level, Kenneth mentioned sort of how the EAP helps the organization. There is a component in the EAP called Manager Assist, which is available for all managers, supervisors in the organization to use, to not necessarily for themselves, but when they need to resolve or think through a personnel issue that they're having. So maybe they're about to do performance reviews. You know how anxious everyone gets when they have to do a performance review, especially if there's some things that they have to talk about, right? And maybe this individual has a particularly negative attitude, or they're combative. You know, how do I deal with that person? How do I make this conversation effective? You can call a manager assist clinician and just have a consultation about that. You know, what is the best way to talk about this performance issue that I'm seeing so that I get the person engaged? I don't shut them off. I don't throw down the curtain so that we, you know, we have a very ineffective conversation. And I think the other thing is, you know, Kenneth was saying, like, look at, you know, all of like your well-being program and sort of look at how it can be impacted by the EAP. That's really it. That's another important layer, because in HR, we typically train managers about what's included in the EAP, and we have one point of contact in HR benefits. But when we think about all individuals that can be affected by the EAP and where are the organizational points in the company, that's another place to spread the word about the EAP so that you can educate them and communicate. So I'm talking about when individuals go out on leave, whether they're mat leave or disability leaves, whatever. Whenever an individual goes out on leave or is coming back from leave, it's always a good idea to signpost the EAP to them. If you're in a situation in the payroll department of an organization and you start getting collection letters or things where it indicates that an individual is having some sort of financial or legal difficulty, the EAP can help with that. So as we think about the medical team and individuals who may come in, the medical team and the EAP can work very closely together to help with mindfulness coaching and other areas. So sustaining the EAP, I think through what Kenneth said, promote, educate, communicate, and then look inside the organization and say, where are these points of entry that our organization could use the EAP to really address some of the sort of the typical things that you have in every organization, but we don't think of using the EAP for those. So I think those are some ways to really sustain it beyond that utilization number.
That's fascinating, thank you. So how do you ensure access of wellbeing services for all employees, regardless of the location they work in?
This is, I'll take Kenneth, I'll start anyway. You know, this has been something that we at Workplace Options have been working on diligently for a while. The president of our organization talked about our EAP being, that he wants to make sure that we reach the maximum number of people, that the program is relevant to what their needs are, and that we get good results. So for years, you know, we've worked with companies that have been, you know, pretty traditional white collar, some blue collar companies. And what we haven't done is take the message of the EAP and communicate it in the way that is most relevant for them. So, and by that I mean, we start out by doing, posters or flyers, and post them in various parts of the organization. We'll do a video orientation. What we've really been challenged to do over the last few years is really look closely at how to get that information, how to communicate and promote the service in a variety of different environments, so that we have the same level of awareness about the program for individuals who work in offices, white collar, and have computers and have break rooms, as we have for individuals who work completely 100% in the field, never walk in an office, and they get their assignments by the computer that they hold in their hand every day. So how do we communicate with them and show the relevance of the program? How do we offer them the same type of educational seminars that we do? So we've been really looking at that, the importance of communicating those messages in different types of work locations. So everything from an industrial camp where workers live at their work site for 2-3 weeks at a time, to individuals who work in the field, to individuals who are in either factories or logistics locations. So the challenge for the EAP is to really make sure that Connect's words about promote, educate, communicate are relevant to those populations. Connect, I'll turn it back over to you.
Now, I think when you list those 3 R's, you're completely on track. And it's really about having different modalities for people can also access the service. So we really believe that, it's about, can an individual access the service when, where, and how best suits them. So whether that's, picking up that phone that Mary Ellen talked about, and it's interesting because I think as we look at the world, we feel that everyone has a cell phone, and research even shows that most people have about 2.5, if not 3 devices. I mean, I have 3 sitting right in front of me myself, but that's not true. Everyone have that smartphone where they're able to just pick up and dial a number, but maybe they do have access, to Mary Ellen's point, to go into the break room where there's a computer that they're able to send a quick message, or they're able to send a web request. So I think, having individuals to be able to access the service when, where, and how they need to is really important, especially to Mary Ellen's point, where you have people from different industries, different locations, some that are very remote. And so another solution that we have often seen that has worked is what we have called like a dedicated on-site or virtual counselor. And this is where companies have, as an extension of the EAP service, there's an individual that's dedicated to an organization that is either physically on site or either virtually connected to an organization, where employees know that this one individual counselor, or maybe depending on how large the organization is, that there's these dedicated individuals that will be here on these certain days or be available on certain days at certain times, so that I can easily still access services. So I think it's really important that we look at that. And when we look at our dedicated on-site or virtual counselors that are an extension of the EAP, it's really nice to be able to embed them into whatever well-being strategies or initiatives that an organization has. We've seen some companies who are like, we just want a dedicated counselor to be available for, on-site counseling, like a drop-in type of situation, whereas others truly embed it into the program, where now they're assisting with, doing trainings, they're assisting with doing lunch and learns or toolbox talks. And we've seen them call many different things, but really embedding them into the organization. So, Mary Ellen, that's what I would add to that.
Sounds good.
Thank you both. So how can we help those companies where it's not the cultural norm to have an employee assistance program?
I think this is a a really interesting one. And I don't know if it were you and I, Meg, who were recently on a call together, but we were actually working with an organization who they felt like, is an EAP really the best solution for our company with the culture that we have? And, half of the individuals on the call or the committee that was making the decision were like, oh my God, yes, this is great. This is wonderful. This is exactly what we've been looking for. And you had another side of the individuals in committee that were like, I don't think this is going to work. You have to understand our culture. If you knew our culture, then you know that, we don't even really address mental health. And that's fair. But when we got on the call with them and started to have a conversation about what those true concerns were in regards to culture and being able to support their employees, it went back to stigma. And of course, when we think about mental health and the stigma that has been long associated with it, then of course there's challenges. But it goes back to one of those words that I said earlier, which is educate. And as we had that conversation together and begin to educate, the word mental health and the word mental illness, like people are still cringing at those words. Like when they hear the word mental illness or mental health, they're like, wait, nope, that's not me. I don't have mental health challenges. No way, Jose. But here's the thing. We all have mental health. We might not all have a mental illness. Two separate things. So it was begin to educate about what we really could support in. And one of my favorite phrases is finding universal themes. Universal themes. Because when we had this conversation of, this doesn't even work for our culture, when we stopped and we paused to ask the universal theme of how many of your employees experience stress? If I were to pause and ask that to the audience today, how many of us have or are experiencing stress? I'm sure every single one of our hands would go up. And that's exactly what happened on the call. They're like, yeah, they do all experience stress. So that was the universal theme. So whether we're talking about stress on the job because of the work demands, the workload, maybe the challenges of working with other people, whether we're talking about the stressors in our family lives, whether we're talking about the stressors in our personal lives, that's a universal theme that every single person can relate to. And so that became the common denominator where we were able to begin to have that conversation of, you know what, we don't have to say, oh, we're coming in to provide mental health support. We're coming in to help reduce the stressors of your employees, which is exactly what mental health is, and finding those different ways for them to cope. So it goes back to that education piece that becomes very important so that we're able to reduce that stigma and begin to bring more awareness. Mary Ellen?
Yeah, thanks, Kenneth. I think, I think not much to add, but a couple of things maybe. What we see when there's sort of a not the cultural norm to deal with mental health issues, as Kenneth said, one of the things that we see is that most individuals, when they have those universal themes that Kenneth was talking about, what will they do with them? So maybe instead of calling the EAP, they may talk to a family member, or they may talk to a spiritual leader, or they may talk to someone who's sort of a trusted advisor. And so somehow somebody in their social network. So what is important in terms of, how we publicize or promote the fact that it's okay to not feel okay today, and you can call and get help, this is one of the other places where those ambassadors that I talked about a little bit earlier come into play, because they're sort of the middle ground. They're the middleman, middle woman, middle person between the actual employee assistance program and the workplace. So the workers. So they're trusted, they're a peer. There's an assumption that I'm going to get the sort of straight dope from this person. And so at that point, they can be used really to sort of bridge that cultural gap and take a chance on using the EAP. The other thing that we often see is that shared stories help, and shared stories from leaders help a lot. So when workers know that the leadership has put an employee assistance program in place because they are concerned about the well-being of all workers, and when those leaders can communicate the message and say, it's okay not to be okay. I've had experience in this. I know of people, my family, something where there's a real connection to make it okay to use that program. That's another way that it helps. And you know, when we look at the numbers of people that we serve, obviously, if we are working in a construction site or a remote location where there's a predominantly male workforce, we know that we've got to really work harder in that environment to make sure that the workers feel that it's okay to use this service. And Kenneth talked about the stigma that if you use some sort of emotional support, that doesn't mean that you're weak, or that doesn't mean that you can't handle it. On the contrary, it means, you know, that you really are courageous and brave, that you're sort of saying, I feel this way and I need to get some help with it. The same way you would if you had something wrong with your heart or your lungs or your eyes. And so we need to really and continue to promote services that help mental health support be very much consistent with the type of physical support that you need when you go to a medical doctor. So
great, thank you.
That's it. Those are some thoughts.
But before I ask the final question, I just wanted to remind people that we're going to take a few minutes at the end of the presentation to take questions from the audience. So to the final question about connecting with the health and safety team, why is it important to discuss well-being with the health and safety team?
Want me to go, Meg?
Yeah, why don't you go first? Okay.
Perfect. You know, I think it's so important because I think I might have said this a little bit earlier in the presentation, where when we think about health, we have historically thought about physical health. But when we talk about health, it's truly inclusive of mental health as well. And so it's super important that we're connected with the health and safety team. Here's the reality. There's this whole emotional cycle that all of us go through throughout the day, every day, several times a day. And that starts with, you know what, there's a certain event or situation or something that someone says to us that starts this emotional cycle. From there, of course, we go on to, I have a thought, whether that thought is negative or positive, we're having a thought. And from there, that leads to some type of emotion, again, whether it's positive or negative, that then leads to a behavior or action. That's an emotional cycle, again, that we go through several times a day, every day. But here's the thing. When we have those emotions, there's typically three things that happen. One, we either embrace those emotions where we're like, you know what, this doesn't feel that great, but I have these coping skills and I'm kind of moving forward. Or you know what, this was absolutely amazing and I want to share it with everyone. So we tend to embrace our emotions. The second one is we tend to avoid our emotions. So you know how, like, growing up, I'm sure maybe we saw like our parents like sweep things underneath the rug, like no big deal, nothing to see here, keep it moving. Or, you know, that's typically that response where let's just avoid it and act like it's not happening. And then, of course, the third thing is that people tend to act on their emotions. And when people begin to act on their emotions, this is where sometimes we can begin to see workplace violence. Now, when we talk about workplace violence, of course, we think about worst case scenario, but there's several layers before it gets to you know, that workplace violence. And I'm often reminded of a U.S. phrase called going postal. And that phrase was coined in like 1986, where there were employees who were going postal, where they went into a shipping facility, a postal facility, and end up shooting, coworkers and managers because of their emotions and their ability of, not being able to control their actions. And what they did was they acted out. And again, that, led to that workplace violence, which we begin to see. And so when we talk about our health and safety teams of, what are they doing? How are we embedding and collaborating, not only about physical health, but that mental health as well. And so that we're able to see those signs and symptoms that Mary Ellen talked about, so that we're able to recognize and respond accordingly. I think the biggest challenge sometimes is as leaders, as managers, as coworkers, when it's kind of like that see something, say something whole phrase that we've heard. It's like we might see something, but we're afraid to say something. And we're afraid to say something either because it's like, you know what, I don't want to step on anyone's toes. I'm not really sure what to say. They might be mad at me, but it's better to say something than to say nothing. And that could just be something simple as pointing out an observation of, hey, Mary Ellen, I noticed that over the last, 2 months, you've been calling out every single Wednesday. And this was a true story, actually. I had an employee that every single Wednesday they were calling out, and I began to notice it, recognizing the signs and symptoms. And so I said something. I said, hey, I noticed that, every Wednesday for the last 2 months you've been calling out. I just wanted to see, is everything okay? And this employee began to sob and cry. And she said, Wednesdays are really hard for me because on Tuesdays, I don't know if you know, but I've recently been going through a divorce. And part of the separation order is that my husband gets the kids on Tuesday night. So every Tuesday night, I have to drop my child off, which makes it hard and difficult for me on Wednesday to come into work. That's why she was calling out. So when we begin to kind of really understand that whole emotional cycle and how it leads to our emotions of, are we going to embrace them? Are we going to avoid them? Or are we going to act out on them? And so that's one of the reasons why it becomes super important that we become lockstep with our health and safety teams to be able to prevent the things that might come from it. Mary Ellen, please add to that.
Yeah, I think thanks. That was really good, Kenneth. I'm thinking also in terms of the connection with the health and safety team. Recently over the last couple of years, I've worked with a couple of our different organizations to implement these ambassador programs. And part of those ambassador programs really have been sort of at a first step to do a well-being assessment, so that we look at sort of the, the components of psychosocial risk, work overload, work pace, work schedule, environment, interpersonal relationships at work, and the homework interface. And I've learned a lot from working with the health and safety team in doing those assessments. And what I've learned is that the HSSE team and most organizations have a very systematic way that they look at the physical environment, and they assess the risk, and they categorize the risk by, high, medium, low, let's say. And in the psychosocial world, the psychosocial risks haven't made it to that level of maturity yet. So we still talk about it in terms of the way we observe, and in the impact that they have on the workplace. So one of the reasons that I'm excited to work more closely with health and safety is that I believe there's a real, mutual benefit that we can get from working together. We can learn as mental health professionals how to be systematic about categorizing psychosocial risk and prioritizing it in the workplace, and having it maybe live side by side with the physical risk that you mentioned earlier, Kenneth, and that the HSSE teams can learn from us about, the things that Kenneth talked about how those risks can impact the individual as they make those decisions between feeling, thought, and behavior. So I just see this as like the, you know, right now we're kind of courting, but like this is really like the perfect marriage to move this whole psychosocial risk concept forward and to help organizations understand it and to sustain ongoing measurement of it in the future.
Thank you. So many thanks to both of you for a really interesting and informative discussion. We've got a few questions from the audience. So if we start with the first one, we encourage managers to have sensitization sessions, but we see many not actively taking part in it, citing work pressure and other priorities. How to have this culture brought about, giving enough time to these sensitization sessions? I hope that made sense.
I'll take a stab at it, and then Meg, kind of feel free to add. You know, this is really interesting because I might have even mentioned this briefly earlier, where, you know, managers are, you know, vital to recognizing and responding and looking at those signs and symptoms because they're interacting with employees on a daily basis. I think a couple of things. One, we can't forget about our managers because, again, I feel like they have their workloads now. We're saying, you know, look at the signs and symptoms, recognize and respond, and the list kind of goes on and on and on. So at the same point, we can't forget about what support our managers need. But at the same time, when we think about the psychosocial risk and mitigating those in the workforce, it's really about having that buy-in from the top down, bottom up, and middle out, where that we make it a priority. I think, you know, the old way of thinking has been almost like if it's not broke, it's not, you know, don't fix it, or, you know, we have checked this box, and because we checked this box, let's kind of keep it moving. But as we begin to implement new things, as we begin to create these strategies, we have to also make sure that we're creating the structure, the time, the resources, the energy to support it. So we can't just throw something on the wall and say, like, yep, we have this, I'm not sure if you said it was a manager sensitization program or whatever type of program it is, but so we can't just say, like, we automatically have this new thing, but did we develop this new strategy? Is it truly a part of our strategy? And are we really creating the resources to support that? So if that means, you know, managers need, you know, X amount of training, if that means managers need additional X amount of time to be able to support or to deliver or to manage that, we have to, as an organization, have to also build that in too. Because if we're continuing to add on to our managers, in addition to their workload and now these new things, we're doing exactly what we're creating that risk. We're creating that psychosocial risk that leads to psychological challenges, that leads to the stress anxiety, which then, of course, leads to people presenteeism, absenteeism, burnout, stress, anxiety, depression, and the list goes on and on and on. And then if that manager ends up going on leave or, you know, calling out sick, those tasks just get redistributed to another manager, another leader, and now we're in this vicious cycle. So again, I think the biggest thing, if I'm understanding the question correctly, is when we implement these new things, we have to also create the structure and the support to go along with it.
And I think, Kenneth, I would add to that, you know, our experience with managers, and I don't know anything about the sensitivity programs that you're offering, but our experience with working with managers is that because they're on the front line of all of this, and they are really seeing, they're the individuals that really see the behaviors change, and they see the struggles that their workers have, and yet at the same time, it's their responsibility to keep everyone working forward and to keep producing and keep meeting your business results. We found that programs that are really effective for managers are ones that focus on sort of awareness of, you know, how stress impacts, awareness of, you know, how to identify signs and symptoms of when an individual on their team is in distress or close to in distress. And then what are some intervention strategies? So, you know, how to have those difficult conversations, you know, how to refer to resources, or like what resources are already in place in the organization and which ones to refer to, you know, depending on what the situation is. And then resilience strategies. So we call them AIR: awareness, intervention, resilience. And so the resilience piece is really, as a manager, here are some resilience techniques that you can use specifically with your team on a daily and weekly basis. So what I'm saying about this is I'm not sure about what the program is, the sensitizing program that is being offered, but where we've seen managers really subscribe and join in and embrace programs have been when they're completely relevant to their workforce and the problems, the issues that they're experiencing on a daily basis. And they can take something from that training or that situation and use it that afternoon after the session, or the next day, or the next time they have a meeting with the employee. So we've seen those work, and I think, like Kenneth said, one of the most important things you can do is invest in your managers, because the managers identify those psychosocial risks on a daily basis. And they have to solve for them, and they can really help the organization move forward.
Fantastic, thank you. And we've just had a comment to say thank you for addressing the query. So apologies for my poor delivery of that question. So hopefully we've got time for one or two more questions. So the next question is, can you speak to promoting the EAP to global employees?
Yeah, I think one of the important things about, you know, the words that Kenneth used are the same. You know, we want to promote and we want to educate and communicate globally, but globally, one message does not fit all. So sometimes the messages have to be adapted. Sometimes the communication lines, the way the message is delivered has to be adapted. So for example, with our team in China, you know, Kenneth talked about access methods. We have a variety of access methods. We have an app, we have phone calls. You can go on the website, you can enter information in whatever language and you'll get information back in that language. We set up WeChat in China because WeChat is the most popular way to communicate and to access things in China. So if you go in China, if you are one of our employees who are in China, you're going to access our program through WeChat. So when you communicate with global employees, the most important thing is to get your local HR team involved in developing the communication plan and the communication strategy, from the access point to the message to how you're going to deliver it, to what are important components that need to be focused on in those areas. Kenneth?
No, I think you covered it, Meg. You know, it really goes back to what we like to call the 80-20 rule, where of course 80% is going to be exact same despite where you're at globally and locations, and that 20% is really taken into consideration the cultural context of each of those locations. And so to Mary Ellen's point, you know, that 20% again is going to be related to that cultural context to ensure that we are reaching the global audience when, where, how they need it, and that we are being relevant, maintaining that reach, and still getting those results.
Thank you both. We've got a couple of questions left, but what we can probably do, if you're happy to take those offline, and then we can follow up with the audience after the webinar. So I just want to say thanks again to Canette and Mary Ellen for sharing their knowledge. I found it a really interesting presentation, and thank you for everyone else for joining us today. As I said earlier, the recording of the webinar will be on the YouTube channel in the next couple of days, so you'll be able to catch up or recap on anything in your own time. Enjoy the rest of your day, and goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.